If you heard this week's podcast, you'll have heard me talking about financial freedom and specifically whether or not it can really be achieved from property investing. You might also have heard me mention the free HMO training that we've got coming up in September, which we're super excited about. We ran it earlier this year. We've run it a couple of times now, always gets great results. But in the run up to that free training, we also release a lot of free content to help you understand whether or not HMO investing is the right investment strategy for you. So bringing those two things together, we're going to be sharing a case study of one of our HMO projects every week for the next 4 weeks. And today, based on the theme of the podcast, financial freedom, I want to share what to this date still stands as one of our favorite deals, one of our most profitable HMO investments, because you'll see when we get to the numbers, it pretty much replaces an average UK income from a profit point of view every year, and has done since we bought it, since we got it set up and running about 5 years ago. So stick with me. I'm going to run through the details quickly of how we found this, what the renovations went like, our biggest struggle, and those all important numbers that I know you love to hear about. So in terms of the purchase, this one was pretty straightforward. Everyone else was looking for residential property in our investment area. Victoria discovered this property, and as you can see, it looks like residential. It looks like two semis or two terraced houses that had at some point been converted into office space. And these type of properties we love. We're buying them as commercial, but they still look and feel like residential property. They don't feel out of place thinking, yeah, that could be somebody's home. Because it was commercial and nobody else really was looking at it. It'd been on the market for a while. It was listed at £225,000. Now, in this area at this point in time, this was back in 2016, I had a look, and residential property in this area was selling for around about £180 per square feet, £180 a square foot, maybe it's about £1,800 per square meter for residential property within 1 kilometre of this specific address. We bought this for £700 per square metre, less than 50% of the cost for the same exact square meterage, just because it was commercial, because everybody else looking to invest was looking for residential stuff. And that still stands true today. We still find commercial stuff significantly cheaper than resi property, but there was no competition. The price was significantly less than we would have paid for a similar sized residential property. We were able to negotiate less than the asking price, and we picked this up for what I still think is the deal of the century. The renovations were a little less straightforward. It was our first commercial to resi conversion. To say that we were in over our heads or jumping in at the deep end is probably pretty fair. Two major things stood out for me on this renovation. First, it was way bigger than we expected it to be, just the volume of work required. The building itself was huge, and then some of the things that we needed to do we hadn't come across before. We had never converted a cellar before, and this had a big cellar. The cellar was about 95 square meters and is the bulk of the communal space for this HMO. We had to tank the entire thing, dig drainage channels. I did not budget for that, and it kind of hit us for about 20 to 25 grand all in to make sure that that cellar was waterproof and was going to continue to be a good space to live in long into the future. So that was one aspect of it. Second thing, I guess, was the fact that it was in a conservation area. Again, relatively new to us. I hadn't factored in things like the fact we'd replaced windows before, but never in a conservation area, and the fact that we had to put in new timber double glazed sash windows because of that conservation area. Again, added to the budget, added to the program, waiting for those windows to be manufactured and installed. So a couple of things here that just kind of hit us where we weren't expecting to. But all in all, we got through it. We learned a lot on the way, as we do with all of our projects, right? We're always picking up stuff that we're not entirely sure how we're going to get through, but you learn so much on the job. And I would never be intimidated by a project as long as you have got a good team around you, and as long as you got some idea of what you're doing. I think everything is figure outable. So renovation didn't exactly go to plan, but we got there. Project all in all took, I think, a little over a year. Planning, I'll come on to in a second, that was the biggest struggle. Took longer than we expected. The renovations, I think, took about 7 months. And then when you factor in conveyancing and all that sort of stuff, probably a little over a year from buying it through to getting it up and running as an HMO. Biggest struggle then, planning on this one was a nightmare. It was the first commercial to resi we'd done. I think it was the first sui generis HMO as well, which is, residential property, usually C3 use class. changing that to a small HMO with up to 6 occupants would be a change from C3 to C4. If you go 7 or more occupants, that's sui generis use class, and it's a little bit more complicated. So there was a few things rooting against us in this case. But biggest mistake we made, using the architect for the planning application. Now, I'm not saying that architects cannot submit planning applications and aren't good at it. Some of them are. But in this case, the architect that we were using, before we found somebody who is an HMO expert and realized the value of having people who are experts in their own fields, they didn't have any HMO experience. They didn't really have any planning experience, certainly not for this type of change. So didn't go to plan. First one was refused. We were over ambitious. We went for a 13 bedroom scheme initially. We reduced that to 11 bedrooms. Finally, we settled on 9 bedrooms, and I'm so glad that we did. Looking back now, 11 and 13 rooms in that house would be way overdeveloped. 9, perfect balance, but we only ended up there through mistakes and learning as we went. But we had the wrong team in place. Didn't know what we were doing. I almost got kicked out of a planning committee meeting. That's a different story for a different day. But big lesson for me on this project, going forwards on every future project, and for you if you're looking to get into any sort of complex planning or anything really on a project, is make sure you've got people who have done it before. If you're paying them for a service, you want to pay the best people, the experts. So we always have a planning consultant now dealing with our planning applications. We have an architect who is specialist in HMO designs. They invest in HMOs themselves, and that really helps us work with them to create the best layouts, the best designs for our projects. So, numbers. I mentioned it was on the market for 225,000. We paid £210,000 for it. Because it was commercial, there was very little interest, there wasn't much competition. We still find that today to an extent. And we were able to pick it up for less than the asking price, £210,000, about £700 per square metre. Absolute bargain compared to the £1,800 a square metre that comparable residential property was selling for. Costs, probably about 20 grand on planning, on legals, on stamp duty, all that good stuff. One of the reasons I love commercial properties, stamp duty is considerably less than on residential properties. You've got a saving there right off the bat that they can then go towards additional renovation costs or whatever else. And our total renovation costs on this were about £130,000. Now that's pretty cheap. Normally for a project like this, a commercial to HMO conversion, we'd probably be looking at maybe £800 a square metre on average across the board, sometimes a little bit less, sometimes a little bit more, but this was definitely on the cheaper end. One of the reasons I think that worked out is because I went into it with, I guess, I said we were in at the deep end, a little bit over our heads. I thought it would be cheaper, and because of that, I was forced to negotiate constantly with every trade to get the best prices that we could, because I didn't want to say, okay, well actually we budgeted 90 grand for this and it's going to cost us double that. We ended up going over budget by about 30%, but it could have been a lot worse because we had that real sort of hunger and tenacity. We needed to fight for every price discount on labor, materials. I started doing a lot of the work myself, not something I would recommend, but don't look at that number of 120 grand for this size of building and think that that is achievable. In a lot of cases, it might be more than that. So our total spend then was about £360,000. We got this valued on a commercial-based valuation. If you're not familiar with that, I talk about it a lot. I won't go into the details here, but basically based on the rental income rather than the bricks and mortar value. Valued at £450,000. We got 75% loan to value on it, which gave us £340,000 back out. We spent 360, we got it refinanced, the bank gave us £340,000, so we had 20 grand cash tied up in this deal. It makes us, on average, over the last 4 or 5 years that it's been up and running, we've tracked every number, all of the income, all of our running costs. Obviously, if there are void periods, then there's no income there, so we haven't tracked that. If there are maintenance, that comes off our costs. So everything that you could think of, this isn't some made up projection of what might be in the future. This is the actual reality over the last 4 or 5 years of this project. It's netted us pre-tax £2,000 per month on average, a little bit more, but we're looking at £24,000 per year pre-tax profit after all of our costs, which is more than 100% return on investment. We're getting 24 grand back a year on £20,000 cash left in that deal. So phenomenal investment, phenomenal return. Our return is almost the equivalent. I think in the UK now, the average UK salary is about 28 grand. This one deal gives us an annual pre-tax profit of £24,000. So definitely something to think about. Bigger deals, more profit, more stress, more headaches sometimes, but it's definitely the way that we like to go. It's not the only way to go, and we'll share case studies from smaller deals over the next couple of weeks as well, including a 3-bedroom HMO, how we got started back in the very early days. So there are multiple different routes that you can take to achieve financial freedom, but one deal like this gets you a very good step of the way there. So hopefully that was useful. If you got any questions, let me know in the comments, and yeah, we'll be back next week with another case study.